I can just go forward. Do you see any kind of escalation like this from a realist perspective?
I think that it is extremely unlikely that Russia would use nuclear weapons unless it was losing on the battlefield. In the beginning of the war in 2022, I think that the United States thought that it could deliver a significant defeat to Russia and knock it out of the ranks of the great powers. In the year 2022, because the Russian army was then in poor shape, relatively poor shape, and the Ukrainian military was doing very well on the battlefield, we thought that we could defeat the Russians on the battlefield inside of Ukraine. That's number one. And number two, as you all remember, we thought that economic sanctions would bring the Russians to their knees. We would deliver these devastating sanctions that would cripple the Russian economy. And that, coupled with the defeats on the battlefield, would effectively knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers. Had that happened, I think the Russians would have probably used nuclear weapons in Ukraine to rescue the situation. And you all want to remember that if Russia were to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, it would not have to fear nuclear retaliation because Ukraine has no nuclear weapons of its own. And there is no way the West would use its nuclear weapons to defend Ukraine. So in a situation where the Russians were backed into a corner, were facing a defeat that was going to knock them out of the ranks of the great powers, I think in that circumstances, it's highly likely they would turn to nuclear weapons. Now, the good news is that's not going to happen. And the reason is that the Russians are winning the war on the battlefield. And the situation is deteriorating for the Ukrainians and for the West. This is why I would argue that the Ukrainians should cut a deal now, because they're going to just lose more territory and more Ukrainians are going to die if they continue the war. And the reason is that the Russians are winning. If you look at the balance of manpower, the balance of artillery, the balance of air power, it's manifestly clear that the Russians are in the driver's seat. And if you take into account the fact that President Trump wants to withdraw significant support for Ukraine, that means that Ukraine is going to lose its principal patron. And it was losing even when Joe Biden was in the White House. You can imagine how bad the situation is going to get if Donald Trump refuses to put more weaponry and more money into the Biden pipeline. So Ukraine is doomed. It's not like Ukraine is going to go down to decisive defeat. There's going to end up being a dysfunctional rump state. Ukraine is going to continue to exist, but it'll be a dysfunctional rump state. All of this is a long way of saying that given that the Russians are winning, there's no incentive for them to use nuclear weapons. And that is good news. But the fact that the Ukrainians are losing is obviously bad news from Ukraine's point of view.
What do you think, Balázs, about the potential